Our story is the story of an idea, the idea of art. It's also the story of power, of the desire to possess and control things in a totalitarian state. In 1938, Hitler developed the plan for establishing a great museum. It was to be built after the war, to bear witness to Germany's greatness. Hitler's greed was unlimited. Special commando units were already on their way throughout Europe. They were looting museums and private art collections in the shadow of the war. They were looking specifically for paintings for Hitler's museum in Linz. No major art collection was safe from their reach. The owners had to exchange their art treasures for their lives. This is where the undertaking art looting began, April 1938. Without encountering resistance, German troops invaded Austria. Germany became Greater Germany. A reception for Adolf Hitler in Linz on the Danube. Hitler spent his youth in this city. This is where he went to school. Now he's returning to the city, which, as the Chancellor of the German Reich, he considers to be his home. It was during this night in Linz that Hitler decided to establish a European art center in Linz with a museum which would eclipse all the art collections of the world. Hitler wanted to convert the city into a so-called Führer city with a splendid boulevard which would lead from the railway station direct to the center of the town, to Hitler's museum. Hitler himself, the would-be painter and architect, drew the first plans and sketches. He could hardly wait to see his dream come true.
Those are the drawings which are typical of Hitler, drawn the same way that he would make sketches of his museum plans in his young days, when he was mainly interested in dividing up the rooms among specific painters and so forth. Here the Gothic room, over there the Renaissance room, the whole works.
The search for the man who was supposed to organize the Linz Museum project, as Hitler wanted it, leads to Dresden. Hans Posse, the long-standing director of the world-famous Dresden Art Gallery, was recommended to Hitler as an expert in the field. Posse, however, lacked an outstanding National Socialist biography.
What we mustn't forget about Hans Posse is that he had just been dismissed as the director of the Dresden Art Gallery because he had allegedly bought degenerated art, or so-called degenerated art. You are probably familiar with this term. Hitler then visited him, together with Martin Bormann, in July 1938. And he was very taken by Hans Posse. Shortly afterwards, Posse was commissioned to make a list of art treasures for Linz, and was then reinstated in his office as director of the art gallery.
I herewith confirm having received this very honorable order, and I am taking the liberty of expressing my most humble gratitude. Heil Hitler. With these words, Posse expressed his gratitude for having been given the order to organize Hitler's museum. During the next days, he acted as Hitler's chief purchaser and most important advisor with regard to art. Posse is given unlimited authority and a generous budget. Money is not an issue. The order, however, is very sensitive. Before Posse can start putting together a top-class art collection, he first has to talk Hitler out of his petty bourgeois taste of art. An audience in the Reich Chancellery. Only if the paintings have been exclusively selected because of their quality could the collection really reflect the greatness of Germany. This is the argument he wanted to use to convince Hitler. The unbelievable happened. Even the almighty Führer gave in to the expert Posse.
It is said that Hitler then proudly showed Posse his own collection, and Posse was evidently very unimpressed with it, and said that it did not really represent the rank of an art gallery as he envisaged it. And Hitler evidently agreed with Posse's criteria and Posse's opinion. Insofar, one must now view Hitler's museum and its style as representing more than Hitler's original private taste.
Posse compiled a list of requests in just a few weeks. Many of the works of art which had earmarked for the museum in Linz were, however, in other countries, and it wasn't always possible to establish exactly where. The search began. Disguised as unsuspicious researchers, two German art historians inspected the storage rooms and depots of various French and Dutch museums. Their real job was to search throughout Europe for works of art which could be attributed to German culture. They made precise lists of everything they found. They were looking for reasons why Germany could lay claim to the works of art, including paintings, that belonged to the private property of the English royal family. The result was a memorandum of several hundred pages, the so-called Kummel Report. This contained the works of art which, according to the Nazis, had been illegally smuggled out of Germany since medieval times. One of the most important works of art on the list was the Ghent altar by Jan van Eyck from the St. Bavo Church in Ghent in Belgium. Today, it's kept behind bulletproof glass at a separate chapel of the Ghent Cathedral.
The historical and artistic value cannot be established. That would be the same as if someone were to ask about the value of the Sistine Chapel. How much is the Sistine Chapel worth? It is for sure one of the greatest masterpieces of Western art. Its value, in a material sense, it simply does not exist, or if it did, it would be a utopian amount.
Ou bien une valeur tout à fait imaginaire.
The Ghent altar had already experienced an eventful history. Without being aware of its value and its significance for art history, individual panels had already been sold during the middle of the 19th century. This enabled the Prussian king to buy a part of the altar. At the beginning of the 20th century, Belgium remembered its great art treasure. In the Versailles Treaty, it demanded this part of the altar back from Germany as a war indemnity.
The Belgians were already very interested in getting their works of art back in 1918, which they themselves had sold a century ago.
C'était l'agneau mystique qui a d'ailleurs valu, oh là là, je ne sais pas, quand même une grande somme.
The Ghent altar was meant to replace a very large amount of money which they had demanded as reparations.
Et vraisemblablement, l'agneau mystique avait...
The altar, obviously, was something like a national symbol.
Un sens, je dirais, de symbolique national.
At least those parts of the altar, which had been bought by the Prussian king in the 19th century, legally belonged to Germany. That was the argument of the Nazis. Whether Hans Posse had planned to have the Ghent altar placed in Hitler's museum in Linz, or whether it was supposed to be brought to Berlin, that's disputed today. Without a doubt, though, Nazi Germany wanted the altar, regardless of the price. The summer of 1939. With each day, the threat of war increased. Europe was sitting on a volcano. While many people in the major European cities were enjoying the last weeks of peace, the officials at the Louvre in Paris were already preparing for an emergency. Headed by Jacques Jaujat, the director of the French National Museums, an emergency plan was developed. Each painting was to be evaluated and prepared for evacuation. Jaujat had small colored dots attached to the back of each painting, yellow, green and red, to highlight the different priorities during the planned relocation. The greatest possible care was required. The Mona Lisa was given 2 red dots, signifying the highest priority. Not only the woman with the enigmatic smile, but also all the other important works of art of the Louvre were placed in crates and prepared for evacuation. A curator of the Louvre recalls,
in the Louvre, there was a giant painting of David, the crowning of Napoleon. The picture is 10 meters long, and it too had to be moved. Upstairs in the Greek section, there was the famous Nike of Samothrace, and this statue had to be carried down the stairs. That was really a task without an end.
The Nike of Samothrace statue, which is from ancient Greece and just over 2,300 years old, along with the Mona Lisa, are probably the most famous works of art in the Louvre.
Our skilled workers came from all parts of the country. That was a great event. The small items were put into crates, but there were also many very large monuments which had to be saved. There were also other things besides the collections from classical antiquity. There were all the paintings, the medieval age. The Louvre really had everything.
Time was getting short. After a few days, the whole Louvre looked like a giant furniture warehouse. Sales staff from the surrounding department stores were recruited to help with the packing. What remained was an empty building with precious little to remind people that this had, just a few days ago, been the home of the world's most important art collection. On the 28th of August 1939, only a few days before the start of the Second World War, the first transport begins its journey.
The lorries of the Comédie Française were used for transports because they were the only ones which were big enough. These lorries were used to transport complete stage settings during the theater's tours. Some of the paintings could be rolled up, the wedding in Cana, for example, but you couldn't do that with all of them.
To remain unnoticed, the lorries usually traveled at night. Except for the museum staff, no one knows the destination. The cargo was simply too valuable. Jacques Jaujat accompanies the first transport himself. On his knees, he is holding what is probably the world's most famous painting. The other curators are also traveling with the transports to protect the works of art.
I was armed. I had a revolver. Can you imagine that? Me with a revolver. But it was necessary. I had all the treasures. I had 2 lorries with drivers for the transports. Otherwise, I was all alone. Everyone else was at war. No one else could be found anymore.
C'était la pauvreté, on ne trouvait plus personne.
There was no hint about the real value of the cargo. The lorries drove through France unnoticed.
Vous croyez qu'on avait le temps d'avoir peur?
Believe me, we had enough time to be frightened.
Ça me ressemble
That
pas.
isn't what I'm usually like.
Dans une
In a situation like that, you aren't afraid. You don't think about being afraid. You try to figure out what you should do. Fear? No, you don't feel that. What should you be afraid of? Getting killed? Well, yes, that can happen.
Mais la peur, non, ça non. D'abord, peur de quoi? D'être tué. Bon, c'est tout.
The 1st of September 1939, the Second World War begins.
During a trip to the front, Hitler greets his bodyguard regiment, which has fought brilliantly during the triumphant invasion of Poland. With the siege of Warsaw, the campaign against Poland comes to an end.
In a blitzkrieg lasting only a few weeks, Poland is conquered and occupied. The German success in the east makes the threat to the west seem even more real. All the works of art have not yet been rescued. The destinations of the nighttime transports, monasteries, churches and palaces in southern France. This is where the works of art are presumably safe, far away from the likely front and protected from aerial bomb attacks. The most important criteria for the selected sites: the doors and windows have to be big enough. Chambord Palace on the Loire became the most important art depot. It hadn't been used for centuries. The sanitary facilities were as old as the works of art, which were now being stored there. The museum workers settled down to a Spartan way of life between the crates. For the children of the curators, this was like a nice holiday trip.
Sur la terrasse du château,
On the terrace of the palace, after the hay harvest, pleasant smells. We saw a real nice-smelling museum out in the open. We were very impressed with how nice that was. Then he said, "Come, follow me into the chapel."
Puis il nous dit, venez, suivez-moi dans la chapelle. Il y avait une grande chapelle.
There was a large chapel there, an abbey. In the chapel there was a crate made of exquisite wood. He opened the crate, which was lined with, I don't know if it was velvet or satin. It might have been velvet because it was red.
Qui était doublé, je ne sais pas si c'était du velours ou du satin, c'était peut-être du velours, c'était rouge.
Suddenly, as the crate was being opened, we saw a smile. It was the smile of the Mona Lisa.
Et c'était le sourire de Mona Lisa.
The 10th of May 1940, Germany attacks Holland, Belgium and France. Contrary to France, the Belgians had failed to take any precautionary measures. Very quickly now, measures had to be taken to protect the works of art. Especially threatened was the Ghent altar.
On a lancé l'idée d'amener le
First, they wanted to take the altar to the United States, which they didn't do. Then, it was supposed to be brought to the crypt of the cathedral, but the crypt was meant to be used as an air raid shelter in the event of bombing raids. Room for at least 500 people was needed, which meant that there was not enough space for safely storing the altar.
While the Germans continued their attack on Belgium, the looting Nazi commandos were waiting for their order to move into Belgium. To take the Ghent altar back to the Reich, Hans Posse asked for help from the Supreme Command of the German Army. The man for this secret mission, Count Wolf Metternich, the German army's art officer. Similar to Posse, Metternich was an educated, internationally recognized art historian. Metternich himself traveled to Ghent. Here, he was supposed to get a first-hand impression of the situation. He was responsible for securing the Ghent altar and having it brought back to Germany. The only way to protect the Ghent altar from being seized by the Germans was to quickly remove it from Belgian territory. 3 lorries were hastily loaded. The drivers were told to take a route of 1,500 kilometers, which would lead them to Rome. The most important portable art treasures of Belgium were meant to be hidden in the Vatican, including the Ghent altar.
Et c'est donc on a mis en sécurité, c'est-à-dire
The altar was taken to a safe place, which means that it was packed into crates on the same day that the Germans invaded Belgium. I think it was the 10th of May, when the altar was taken apart and all the pieces were packed into crates.
To transport a work of art the size and significance of the Ghent altar over a distance of 1,500 kilometers would already be quite a risky undertaking during normal conditions and peaceful times. But now a war was raging. It was a trip into the unknown. The altar was rescued just in time. Count Metternich arrived too late. The place in the Cathedral of Ghent, where the altar was normally located, was empty. Metternich returns home empty-handed. The task now was to find out where the Ghent altar was hidden. The transport with the Ghent altar only managed to move a few kilometers a day on small, minor roads. The major roads were only open to military traffic. In Péronne, just behind the French border, the lorry met head-on with a German tank division which was rushing to the English Channel. Since they couldn't continue their journey, the occupants of the lorry had no other choice but to hide the altar for a few days. Later, the official report will say that the altar survived the tank guns without suffering any damage. After 3 days, the lorry was able to continue its journey. By now, Italy had also entered the war. This meant that the route to the Vatican was now closed. In the far south of France, in Pau Palace at the foot of the Pyrenees, the Ghent altar was provisionally stored with the consent of the French government. While the German task force was looking for the whereabouts of the Ghent altar, Hans Posse, the head of the Linz Special Mission, had already taken a careful look at the Dutch art scene. The Dutch art trade, Posse writes, possesses numerous significant works of art which are just what the Führer is looking for. After the German invasion, life in Amsterdam only appeared to continue as normal as before. The numerous Jewish art dealers had an uneasy feeling about what was in store for them. Within a few days, the Nazi henchmen were already bearing down on them. Some of them managed to flee the country while leaving their paintings behind. Yet not all of them reacted quickly enough after the German invasion. One man was especially in danger through the plans of Posse, Jacques Goudsticker, probably the most enigmatic figure of the Dutch art scene. In the course of many years, he'd collected the most significant private art collection of the Netherlands. Paintings of Rembrandt, Rubens, Van Gogh and other masters, all works of art which Posse would really have liked to have seen in his Linz collection. Because of their Jewish descent, Goudsticker and his family were also personally in danger. When the Germans arrived in Holland, Goudsticker and his family decided to flee, leaving behind their great collection. Without valid identity papers and without tickets for a ship, they left for the harbour of IJmuiden on the 15th of May. All other routes to a safe place outside the country were closed. The harbour was overcrowded with refugees. With the help of friends, Goudsticker and his family nevertheless managed to get on board the ship Bodengraven. The ship was sailing for Dover, Liverpool and South America. Saved in the nick of time? I have to get some fresh air. With these words, Jacques Goudsticker said goodbye to his wife a few days later. These were also his last words. Through an unsecured hatch, he fell into the ship's hold. Whether this was an accident or suicide, this was never clarified. With the certificate issued by Hitler's office, which committed all German authorities in the occupied territories to assist him in his work, Posse tries to secure the best items from the Goudsticker collection at favourable prices. Yet, as Metternich in Belgium before him, Posse also arrived too late. Another great Nazi figure had beaten him to the Dutch art market. Hermann Göring, the Reich's aviation minister and the second most powerful man in the country after Hitler. He'd been promoting his public image with the help of art, champagne and opulent parties. Göring had excellent contacts. Agents and henchmen were in action everywhere. He had 600 paintings removed from the Goudsticker collection for his own private collection, for 2 million Dutch guilder. Göring simply helped himself to funds from the Reich Aviation Ministry. Posse was upset. Göring had taken the best objects away from him under his nose. To put an end to Göring's activities, he had to intervene directly through Martin Bormann, Adolf Hitler's personal assistant.
Dear head of the German Reich, for the Rubens from the Goudsticker collection, which I accessed first, other purchasers tried to outbid me by making a higher offer of 20,000 marks, although they should have known for whom I am purchasing these paintings. It is quite clear that this is driving the prices up outrageously.
Posse succeeds with his intervention.
This led to the so-called Hitler enactment. In principle, this meant that Hitler himself could decide which paintings he wanted reserved for Linz. Other people were also involved. Göring and other great party figures collected large amounts of art. To put an end to this, so that the confiscated Jewish property would not be sold to other party leaders, Hitler made this enactment. And they then systematically selected what they wanted.
The 14th of June, 1940. The German troops celebrated their victory with a symbolic parade through the Arc de Triomphe. France had been defeated after a blitzkrieg lasting only a few weeks. At the break of day, after the signing of the armistice agreement confirming the French surrender, Hitler visited Paris. Following in the shadow of the regular troops, the art-looting Nazi commandos moved into the city on the Seine. After Holland and Belgium, France now becomes the next victim of the Nazi greed for art. Many Jewish art collectors had fled the city just in time, leaving their collections behind unprotected against the looting Nazis. The Nazis became more and more ruthless. While they were still buying art in Holland and Belgium to maintain a legal appearance, they were now ruthlessly looting and expropriating. The owners got no compensation, not even a confirmation of having been expropriated. The Jeu de Paume, an empty museum hidden in the heart of Paris, was selected as an inconspicuous depot for the confiscated paintings, which was also easy to guard. Rose Valland worked at the Jeu de Paume as the only French national among many Germans. New paintings were being brought there every day. All the looted paintings were registered and stamped on the back. Rose Valland carefully observed the activities of the Germans working at the museum.
Rose Valland was not a regular member of the museum's staff. She worked on an honorary basis at the Jeu de Paume Museum at the Place de la Concorde.
She
was a woman in her mid-50s, a very resolute old maid.
Exactement.
Rose Valland took up her real work at night. She secretly kept account of everything that the looting Nazi commandos brought to the Jeu de Paume. For months on end, she collected information resembling pieces of a puzzle. Each bit of information could become vital later. Rose Valland, a spy in France at the most important site where the National Socialists were collecting the stolen art which was being transported to Germany. The 30th of October 1940, more than 400 crates with works of art were brought to the Jeu de Paume Museum. These were paintings from the mainly private art collections of France, the Rothschild and the Wildenstein collections. The paintings were being hung up, similar to a real art exhibition. A very important visitor was coming to the museum. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring was on his way to the Jeu de Paume. He calls himself a Baroque man, which means that he can never get enough. He was traveling up and down Europe in a luxurious special train in search of treasures for his pompous residence. Hermann Göring visited Paris on the 3rd of November 1940. The only purpose of his trip was to visit the exhibition at the Jeu de Paume Museum. Göring spent 2 days at the Jeu de Paume. Highly excited, he had each significant work of art explained to him. But this time, Göring contented himself with having photographs taken of the works of art and sending Hitler the catalogue. Only then did he make his selection. Göring also can't afford to annoy Hitler for too long, even though he's quite tempted at times. Rose Valland observes what's going on with disgust and great attentiveness.
She wrote down the numbers of all the crates which were taken by Goering's men. Goering had a whole host of art thieves. She has provided us with all the numbers. She also noted where the transports were going to. Only through this were we able to locate them again after the war. She was an incredible woman. She was an old maid who'd only lived for her assignment. Through her work, she became a real heroine.
Mais quand elle s'y est mise, elle est devenue un véritable soldat.
Rose Valland's work remained unnoticed. Putting herself at considerable risk, she passed the reports of the activities at the Jeux de Paume Museum on to members of the French resistance. Especially at the French railway, the French resistance had established a well-developed network of collaborators. Rose Valland's lists are taken out of the country with the help of contacts and secret couriers. By listening to the BBC, Rose Valland found out weeks or perhaps days later whether the messages had reached their destination. The programs contained coded news and secret information.
La vache soupire. La cigale prend le métro. Le requin avale la truite. Il fait froid l'hiver.
Paris. On the surface, life went on as usual under the occupation force.
The German occupation authorities ordered us to reopen the Louvre. So we opened it with what was left, since all significant works of art had been removed for safekeeping. Every day we heard the sound of army boots. You know those boots with nails under them on the marble floors of the Louvre. That was very loud. It was unbearable. We had to replace almost the whole marble floor since it cracked under the nails of the boots. But okay, that wasn't the worst.
While the officers of the occupation forces pretended to be knowledgeable art connoisseurs, the looting of the private collections continued. Often this was done so hastily and unplanned that it only increased the general chaos. Almost every day new works of art were being brought to the Jeux de Paume, which had to be listed. The 60 people working at the Jeux de Paume Museum were being kept very busy. They also didn't always know where the stolen art had been taken from. Often they could only note unknown origin. The works of art, which could be of interest to Hitler or Goering, were loaded at night and taken to Germany, mainly in heated first-class railway coaches. 29 such large transports were carried out between April 1941 and July 1944. 120 railway coaches with more than 20,000 works of art crossed the border between France and Germany during this time. Hans Posser's collection for Hitler's museum in Linz also slowly begins to take shape. The number of pictures which had been reserved for Linz already equaled several hundred. Posser prepared photo albums which were to be presented to Hitler to document the progress of the collection. These photo albums were discovered just a few years ago in an archive in Berlin. They are now being kept at the German Historic Museum in Berlin, a unique record.
The problem was simply that the construction of the museum dragged on. It never really got beyond the planning phase. The more that the war was affecting everyday life, the less likely it became that the building would ever be finished. To give Hitler an overview of the status of his collection, the albums were produced, and they were then sent to the Obersalzberg.
The Berghof on the Obersalzberg, Hitler's retreat. The photo albums were presented to him there as a gift on his birthday or during other festivities.
The albums were also made as a present for the Führer. That means he actually did enjoy receiving them. He studied these albums. We know that he had Posse show him these albums at the start of the war, during the attack on Norway and Denmark, and that he discussed art with him, which was more important to him than the situation at the front.
The 22nd of June 1941, the attack on the Soviet Union begins. The German army attacked the Soviet Union on a front extending from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathian Mountains. Compared with the art of Western Europe, the Nazis considered the art of the Slavic people to be of inferior value. Libraries, pictures, altars, frescoes, icons, furniture, the cultural assets of Eastern Europe were not looted but rather destroyed. The cultural identity of the Eastern European countries was meant to be destroyed. Hans Posse wrote,
"With just a few exceptions, I believe that the Eastern territories are not very important for the Linz collection. These exceptions apply exclusively to the art of German origin."
Of special interest for Posse were the great art collections in Leningrad, formerly St. Petersburg. As early as the autumn of 1941, German troops had come within just a few kilometers of the city. The Eremitage, probably Russia's most famous art museum, was closed to the public. Aided by the famous Northern Lights, people were working day and night there. Students arrived to help the museum staff. The precious works of art were packed and prepared for transport. More than 1 million works of art were evacuated in time. The German advance, however, suddenly comes to a halt. A blockade begins. Leningrad is supposed to be starved out and then razed to the ground. More than 1 million people died during the first winter of the war. The Germans, however, failed to capture Leningrad. But the German army celebrated further triumphs elsewhere.
Marshal Rommel at the front line. The southern cornerstone of the British positions has been taken. The German and Italian units are advancing to the north, where they have cut off the British troops near Akroma from their connection with Tobruk.
June 1942. In Africa, Field Marshal Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, is preparing for a victory parade in Cairo. In high spirits, Hitler decided to bring the Ghent altar to Germany. The Ghent altar, however, was still in Pau, at the foot of the Pyrenees, and Pau was still in unoccupied France, where the Nazis didn't have direct access. But even this aspect of international law was no longer being respected. The director of the Bavarian Art Gallery, Ernst Büchner, was ordered to travel to Pau. On the 29th of July 1942, the small convoy passed the border to the unoccupied part of France, arriving in Pau shortly afterwards. Here, dramatic negotiations began. The French refused to surrender the Alta. Büchner, however, didn't give up. He called the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. The intervention succeeded. Under pressure, the French government yielded to the German demands. Büchner had clear instructions. He was supposed to bring the complete Alta, not just the panels which had been purchased by the Prussian king in the 19th century, back to Germany. The complete Alta was now put onto lorries to be taken to the German Reich. Where exactly remained a secret. A few days later, Büchner enthusiastically reported his successful mission to Hitler. Many paintings for which the Nazis had no use remained in France. Modern art and degenerated art from the looted collections was taking up more and more space at the Jeu de Paume Museum. Space which was urgently needed for storing the paintings destined for Linz. On the 19th of July 1942, an important decision was made. Degenerated art, which couldn't be sold on the international art market, was taken off the lists and prepared for destruction. Rose Valland could only stand and watch as the paintings which had been sorted out were burnt in the garden of the Jeu de Paume Museum on the 27th of July 1942. The works of some of the following painters were destroyed here: Pablo Picasso, Paul Klee, Max Ernst, Juan Miró, and Salvador Dali. Hitler was at the peak of his power. In Linz, he celebrated his success. Between 1938 and 1945, he visited the city 10 times, in which he'd spent his youth. However, the plans for building a museum were shelved for the duration of the war. The opening of the museum was scheduled for the year 1950. This was a bitter setback for Hitler's museum plans. Hans Posse, Hitler's special museum commissioner, died of cancer during the winter of 1943. A state funeral was held for him. The tides of fortune in the war had also turned against the Germans. In Stalingrad, the German army unexpectedly suffered its worst defeat during the winter of 1942-43, with the complete army having to surrender. In the West, the Allies stepped up their bombing raids on German cities. To avoid them being damaged during the bomb attacks, the looted works of art were secretly moved to old mines and hidden. For nights on end, Rose Valland would sit in front of her radio and listen for the latest news. Meanwhile, in the United States, special art protection officers were being briefed. On D-Day, they'll be crossing the channel in the footsteps of the fighting troops. Their mission is to search among the ruins and destruction for the works of art which had been looted by the Nazis. A dramatic race to rescue the works of art began. This is where the looted pictures disappeared. Here in the Salzkammergut of Austria, deep inside this mountain. Near the small town of Alt-Aussee, there's a salt mine which is more than 700 years old. It was chosen to protect the paintings, which had been looted since the beginning of the war from the bombing raids of the Allied forces. The main problem was how to preserve the art treasures.
Research was done before the paintings were stored here. Long-term research was carried out during a 6-month period where it was discovered that this was absolutely the best room. The works of art don't age here.
In the St. Barbara Chapel of the miners, several hundred meters deep in the mountain, there was a 300-year-old painting in a wonderful condition. Here the experts could see that the works of art would not be damaged by the climate in the mountain. On the 13th of June 1943, Hitler had the mine converted into a depot for his collection of art destined for Linz. Responsible for preserving the works of art in this underground world was one man, Karl Sieber, a small, unassuming restorer of paintings. As were most of the people who worked here, he was also a dedicated lover of art. When they arrived, all the works of art were exactly registered and photographed. The photographer, Eva Frodel-Kraft, recalls.
You had to document and write the numbers of the photographs on the lists and hand them into an archive. That was a well-organized administration job. It was not like, well, here comes a lorry and let's quickly put everything inside somewhere. No, that was a completely organized administrative job which took months. It went on for months and months.
Hundreds, soon thousands of paintings were stored in the mine. Each single shelf was numbered. None of the precious works of art were allowed to get lost. England, the spring of 1944. Preparations are being made for the greatest military operation in the history of mankind. Tens of thousands of tanks and hundreds of thousands of soldiers are already waiting to wrench the command of the European continent from Hitler's grasp. While the soldiers were preparing themselves for the invasion, the educated classes of America were thinking about Europe's works of art. They were worried that the European cities, with their cultural sites of inestimable value, would be destroyed during the advance of the Allied armies and the planned aerial bomb attacks. An Art Protection Commission was established in America. Its job was to make sure that the cultural heritage of Europe was accounted for during the military operations. This, however, required intelligence on the exact location of all the works of art in Europe. New York, Frick Art Reference Library, a private library specializing in art history near Central Park. During the war, this was to become the headquarters of the American efforts to protect European art. Even today, a unique document is kept here, the Frick Atlas of Europe, a work of several volumes, which lists all the important art treasures of Europe.
The information came from, in part, the guidebooks that are a very rich component of our collection here at the Frick Art Reference Library. Some were the personal guidebooks of Helen Clay Frick that she'd amassed during her own travels, and some were acquired for the purposes of documenting the photographs in our photo archive here. And then the photo archive itself was very valuable in researching the whereabouts of important works of art that should be protected.
On the 15th of July, 1943, the reading room of the Frick Art Reference Library was closed to the public for the duration of the war. Now all the major works of art of Europe had to be listed. The main source of funds for this ambitious project was the Rockefeller Foundation. In painstaking work, the staff followed up on all the information they were provided with. The works of art were entered on maps of countries and cities. These were then photographed. In the end, more than 700 somewhat unfocused maps were provided to the American Army.
I believe it was from the command central that the maps were studied and used, and therefore the targeting of the Allied bombs was thought through on a fairly high military level, and that was what was then forwarded to the pilots themselves in the bombers.
The 6th of June, 1944. Operation Overlord. The invasion of Normandy begins. After only a few days, the Allies had already secured a bridgehead. Among the divisions which landed, there were also special units whose only task was to search for and rescue works of art. Many of these people had never before worn a uniform or held a gun. In their civilian jobs, they'd been architects, art historians, sculptors and photographers. And now they'd been commissioned by the US Army to work as art detectives. Two of these people were Walker Hancock and Robert Posey. For their work, they used the maps prepared by the Frick Art Reference Library. One of the most important works of art which they were looking for was the Ghent altar from the St. Bavo Cathedral in Ghent in Belgium. It had been stolen by the Germans in 1942. A world-famous work of art, comparable with the Mona Lisa and the Sistine Chapel. The detective work began. The first weeks, however, were frustrating for the American art protection units. The cities and towns in northern France, which the American troops passed through, had been almost completely destroyed by the fierce battles during the invasion. One of the first French cities to be liberated is Cannes. Almost 70% of the city had been destroyed. How meaningful is it to search for pictures and other works of art in these ruins? To keep from despairing, you simply had to ignore the hopelessness of the whole situation. Hancock wrote later, "You only had one choice, to keep going." With the advancing Allied troops, the transports to the Altaussee mine in Austria were stepped up. In September 1944, 3 months after the invasion of Normandy, the Ghent altar was brought to the mine. While unloading the altar, the staff discovered that the panel with St. John had been damaged.
The danger was not in the salt mines. The danger was always during the transports, when it rained or snowed and the objects were loaded onto open lorries. So of course they would get wet, and they arrived wet in the salt mine. That was very difficult. There was always a chemist on hand who would examine the objects and look after them.
Karl Sieber decided that St. John had to be restored. The panel was taken to a workshop which he'd set up in the mine where the damage could be repaired immediately. For days on end, Sieber attempted to restore the precious altar wing. The remainder of the altar was stored in the so-called minerals chamber deep in the mountain. For the art lovers among the staff, this was a very moving event.
We then went into the room. There was no electric light there yet, and he held a carbide lamp up because it was completely dark. Suddenly, the Ghent altar shone in the light of the carbide lamp. That was a very moving sight. You mustn't think that I had time to immerse myself in the work of art. It was a sensation that it was even there. Of course, I was very impressed.
Meanwhile, in France, the American art protection officers have not made much progress in their search for works of art. The maps they've been given are more or less useless considering the extent of the war destruction. Many of the works of art which the officers are looking for have either been destroyed or are lost. That's why regular soldiers were also asked to help the art protection officers during their search. They willingly helped out even though they lacked the necessary expertise. They immediately reported any plain country paintings which they found as if it was a world-famous Michelangelo. That's why Walker Hancock was so surprised when one day he was given a message which seemed to reveal unusual expertise. The message said that a Bruegel had been found in a house. Without hesitating, Hancock immediately went to visit the house. The trip was not very safe as the house from which the Bruegel had been reported was close to the front. Just the previous day, a battle had been raging here, and German mortars could still hit the place at any time. My Lord, what a war! Walker Hancock would write in his memoirs later. But the trip was worth it. The painting was genuine, probably from the studio of Peter Bruegel the Elder. It had to be removed from the combat zone as quickly as possible. The first great success for Walker Hancock, a pure coincidence. The search continued. However, there were still no traces of the great art collections, including the Ghent altar. August 1944. The German defense lines have finally been broken through. With each day, the Allied armies are getting closer to Paris. Of all places, Chambord Palace on the Loire is being used as an assembly point for the Allied bomber squadrons flying against the German positions. This is where large amounts of art treasures from the Louvre had been stored since the outbreak of the war. Aerial battles took place repeatedly above the chateau. An English plane crashed onto the lawn. The art treasures, however, remained undamaged. Only a few days after the advancing combat troops, the art protection officers arrived at the palaces along the Loire. Their job was to protect the palaces from the marauding troops within their own army. After the grueling battles with the heavy losses, the palaces were especially popular as troop quarters, with often devastating effects for the interior and the furniture. Because the art protection officers were not authorized to stop the actions of their own troops, they had to resort to a simple trick. First, they secured the buildings with so-called off-limit signs, which cautioned the soldiers to proceed with care to protect the art treasures. When this wouldn't help, they resorted to a more severe measure. They would mark the buildings with white tape, the Allied symbol for hidden mines, which proved to be the only really effective warning. Meanwhile, the Germans were getting ready to defend themselves in Paris. Tanks were being positioned throughout the city and trenches were being dug. The German troops were instructed to expect house-to-house fighting and blanket aerial bomb attacks. The Jeu de Paume Museum was located in the heart of Paris. The Germans had used it for many years as a depot for the stolen art collections. Now the remaining paintings were to be brought to Germany before the Allies reached Paris. For years now, the activities of the Germans were being carefully observed by Rose Valland, an unusual woman.
The fact was that she was, in essence, a double agent, because she was chronicling very assiduously every work of art that came into the Jeu de Paume, purporting to be doing this on behalf of the Nazis, and much of this in preparation for works of art going to Hitler's museum in Linz.
During the day, Rose Valland would work for the Germans, and at night, she would work for the French resistance. At the end of July 1944, Rose Valland noticed that paintings were being packed into crates and taken to the railway station. In the transport papers, she discovered the wagon numbers of the paintings being removed.
She was very bright and very amusing and civilized, and with her hatred of Nazi-dom as an idea, of course, was absolutely total.
Everywhere in Paris, the resistance was preparing to commit acts of sabotage and passive resistance to disturb and unnerve the German troops. While the works of art were waiting at the Paris railway station to be dispatched to Germany, Rose Valland was able to pass on her information to the French resistance movement. The trains were already queuing up at the railway stations. The train with the looted paintings also had to wait. A whole week passed. Then it would travel for a few kilometers, and then halt again. Mechanical problems. Allegedly, the engine had to be replaced. While the Allies prepared to take Paris, inside the city, an uprising against the Germans began. The German commander disobeyed his orders and thus saved Paris from being destroyed. On the 25th of August, the Germans surrendered to the insurgents and the advancing Allied armies. The Americans and the British had expected to find a starved city with social unrest and outbreaks of disease. But the opposite was the case. The city immediately came to life again. The art protection officers moved into Paris together with the combat troops. They hoped to get the first useful bits of information about the whereabouts of the paintings that had been looted by the Nazis. Here, Rose Valland was seen as being the key expert. However, in the eyes of the Americans, she was also a collaborator who'd worked for the Germans. Could she be trusted? Rose Valland also hesitated. Were the Americans really sincere, or were they planning to loot the works of art themselves and take them over to the United States? The first meeting ended without a result. Then, however, Rose Valland became friends with an art protector in uniform. They would go out for meals together and meet in cafes. Rose Valland became the most important source of information for the Americans.
We had a drawer full of everything. Yes, this went to that monastery, and this went way over there, and this one went there. But all that kind of thing was that she achieved.
The information provided by Rose Valland raised hopes that the lost art treasures had not been destroyed, but rather that they'd been stored in secret depots in the German Reich. The Art Protection Task Force finally had a firm lead. The noose around Germany was also being tightened from the east. In the autumn of 1944, the Red Army crossed the border of the German Reich. What the Americans didn't know, however, was that after his victory in Stalingrad, Stalin had decided to make up for the war damages which the Germans had caused in the Soviet Union by confiscating German cultural assets. He planned to open a museum in Moscow with the looted art. Headed by the Soviet Secret Service, so-called trophy commissions were attached to the Red Army. One of these commissions was headed by Natalia Sokolova. Together with a small staff, she was supposed to search for valuable paintings in Germany, just like the art protection officers from the West. The race for the looted works of art began. The war during the winter of 1944-45. In Alt Aussee in the Austrian Alps, a state of emergency now existed. Paintings were still being delivered every day, at a great risk.
The lorries drove right up to Alt Aussee. The winters in Alt Aussee, however, very severe. 2 or 3 meters of snow are not uncommon here. Works of art were being brought up Steinberg Mountain by special tracked vehicles, which had actually been built for the Russian campaign.
Many of the paintings which arrived were damaged, and the space in the front chambers of the old salt mine was quickly being filled. It became more and more difficult to keep things under control at the mountain.
Although they were being properly stored, we could no longer work with such great care as in the beginning when we were still lining the shelves. The war situation was much more dramatic now.
March 1945, the American army crosses the Rhine. The war was back to where it had started. According to information provided to the American army by Rose Valland, In Siegen, not far from Cologne, there was a mine with a huge art depot. It was now Easter Sunday, 1945. Instead of the works of art, the Americans found civilians, Germans who were hiding in the mountain. Stricken with fear, they were awaiting the revenge of the victors. For them, it was the first encounter with the victorious power. The tunnel went deeper and deeper into the mountain. Would the mine reveal other secrets? Then, in a second tunnel, hundreds of meters deep, the American art protection officers made another discovery. More than 600 paintings from German museums and countless crates with gold and silver jewelry. What they didn't find were the works of art which the Germans had looted from all over Europe. The search for the Ghent altar continues. Meanwhile, Natalia Sokolova was following another lead. She had been ordered to advance towards Dresden. Before the war, the city had housed a world-famous art gallery with countless valuable paintings which Stalin wanted for his collection of looted art. It was not known how many of these works of art had survived the ravages of the war. In April 1945, the Red Army reached the outer districts of Berlin. Hitler retreated into his bunker under the Reich Chancellery. In February, he'd been given the final model of his Linz museum, and now he took it into the underworld with him. While holed up in his bunker, he wrote,
"I never collected my paintings for private reasons, but rather to establish an art gallery in my hometown of Linz on the Danube. It is my greatest wish that this legacy of mine shall be fulfilled."
In the east and the west, the troops of the anti-Hitler coalition once again encountered fierce resistance. The Americans were still unaware of the whereabouts of the Nazis' most important art depot. In Trier, Robert Posey finally gets a vital hint from a former member of the Linz Museum project. The Ghent altar and the other works of art which have been looted for the Linz Museum are located in a salt mine in Alt-Aussee in Austria. On the 19th of March, Hitler had ordered the destruction of everything which could possibly be of use to the enemy. Now, just before Hitler committed suicide, this order was extended to include all works of art.
That was a real dramatic situation because the head of the Nazi administrative district of Upper Austria and the Upper Danube, as it was then called, was a fanatic Nazi who had ordered the mine to be blown up to destroy the works of art that were inside so that the enemy could not get their hands on them.
In Alt-Aussee, everything was being prepared to blow up the mine. Secret crates labeled marble were being brought into the chambers. More than 8,000 of the most valuable works of art from all over Europe were on the verge of being completely destroyed. It was then that the Austrian miners decided to act. They'd heard of art treasures which had been stored in the mountain. They now visited the only man who appeared to be trustworthy enough and who had access to the tunnel, Karl Sieber, the restorer of paintings. He knew every square meter of the tunnel system, and he agreed to join in on the conspiracy. Together, they decided to blow up the tunnel, but in a way which, instead of damaging the paintings, would only block off the entrance to the chambers.
But the miners were able to prevent that. They were, of course, less worried about the works of art than about losing their jobs if the mountain was blown up.
Hätten sie ja ihren Job verloren, denn ein Bergwerk, das zugesprengt ist, kann man nicht.
It would have been very difficult to get the mine going again. That's why the miners, in a dramatic mission, removed the crates with explosives, which the Nazi leader had already taken into the mine. That's why the mountain wasn't blown up, thanks to the locals.
The 7th of May 1945, one day before the war ended. Captain Posey arrived at the salt mine. He was unaware of the plans for blowing up the mine. He only knew that he had to be quicker than the Red Army. The Soviets, however, were unaware of the art treasures hidden in the salt mine. The 8th of May, 1945, the day the war ended, the Red Army entered Dresden. The former art center Dresden is a scene of devastation, having been almost completely destroyed by the bombing raids from the 13th of February 1945. Only a few days after the end of the war, the Soviet Trophy Commission, headed by Natalia Sokolova, started to search for the city's world-famous works of art among the ruins. Recalling this later in her writings, Natalia Sokolova said that they almost fainted upon seeing the destruction and smelling the stench of the corpses in the city. In May 1945, many German cities looked like Dresden. For a time, the search for works of art was no longer a priority. However, only a few days later, Natalia Sokolova already had a firm lead. Although the famous art gallery had been destroyed, the paintings had been rescued in time. Her search began. The masterpieces from Dresden's museums had allegedly been hidden in the abandoned tunnel of a mine in the nearby Elbe Sandstone Mountains. Similar to the American art protection officers, the Red Army also had to carry out its search in the catacombs of the Third Reich. Golden frames suddenly appeared in the light of a torch. Natalia Sokolova found almost all the famous paintings of Dresden in this tunnel. Rescued, the famous Ganymede painting by Rembrandt. Another sensational find was the Sistine Madonna by Raphael. On the same day that the Red Army entered Dresden, Captain Posey also arrived at Alt-Aussee. After 24 hours, he dug a passage through the blown-up entrance. He was then standing in the middle of the most secret art depot of the Third Reich. He'd found the art collection of Hitler's museum, abandoned and intact. The treasures included the long-lost Ghent altar, hastily packed yet almost undamaged. A total of about 8,000 works of art were found in Alt-Aussee. Not all the paintings had been destined for Hitler's museum in Linz. Paintings from German and Austrian museums, from Berlin and Vienna, were also found.
This is where the works of the greatest European artists had been stored. Whether Michelangelo, Vermeer, Bruegel or Titian, they were all here. When the depot was discovered, the value of the art found here was estimated at $3.5 billion.
The art protection officers had finished their search, yet the mountains still held unexpected treasures.
For a long time it was assumed that an angel from a wing of the Ghent altar had been lost, until one day during an inspection of the tunnel, one appeared. It had been turned upside down on 2 wooden trestles and used as a table by the miners when they were having a tea break. On the back you can still see the cutting marks of the knives they used while they were eating here.
After the fighting had ceased, works of art were found everywhere in the German Reich. In mines, in castles and in cowsheds, as well as in railway wagons, which had simply been abandoned in the middle of nowhere. During the next weeks, Robert Posey, Walker Hancock and their colleagues discovered more than 2,000 such hiding places. The art protection officers were not always treated friendly by the people looking after the art treasures. Sometimes they had to force their way into the secret art depots. Afterwards, they proudly presented what they'd found. The fact that this search for works of art was also used to let countless paintings, sculptures, pieces of porcelain and jewellery secretly disappear into the pockets of GIs and thus end up in the United States wasn't made public. The finds of the US Army were especially plentiful on the Berghof in Berchtesgaden. This is where the great Nazi figures, including Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring, had their splendid residences, which they furnished with valuable paintings.
near Berchtesgaden, the 101st Airborne Division uncovers Hermann Goering's personal art collection, hidden in a subterranean chamber. 1,200 artworks worth untold millions are included. The treasures will go back to rightful owners in pillaged nations.
Immediately after the works of art had been secured, the paintings were taken away from Berchtesgaden again, similar to Alt-Aussee. The transport conditions were not much better than when they first arrived.
The first works of art were taken out of the mine on the 10th of May after the trench had been uncovered again. It had been blown up by the miners professionally, so that only the entrance was blocked. By the end of 1945, many of the paintings had been taken to a collecting point in Munich, but there were also works of art which were to be stored here for almost 20 years, until the 60s, when restitution issues were clarified, after which they were then finally returned to their rightful owners.
To enable the art treasures to be correctly returned, the US Army had already organized 3 central collecting points for art, the most important one being in Munich. The first works of art from Alt-Aussee and elsewhere arrived here on the 17th of June. Until the end of the year, almost 20,000 works of art were to be deposited initially for an indefinite time in Munich. The staff immediately took up their work. Along with 4 members of the US Army, more than 100 German civilians were also busy listing the paintings. This, however, did not solve the problem of returning the works of art. Often there was no information available about the former owner. One day, Lane Faison gets a visit from an old lady.
Dear sweet lady who wanted her 18th century Paris-style rocking chair. I mean, this kind of chair. I said, well, my dear lady, we probably have 300 of those. There's no possible way of identifying yours. And so you can't have that, we can't just say, take one.
The Americans refused to hand back works of art to private individuals, regardless of how legitimate their claims were. It was only at the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945 that a solution was found. The works of art were to be officially returned to the countries from which they'd been stolen. It was then up to the respective governments to return them to the museums or private collectors as the legitimate owners.
We never dealt with an individual. That's an important point to make. We dealt with the government. We sent things to France, we sent them to the Louvre. We sent things to Belgium, and it went to Brussels. The Ghent altar that I keep hearing about, a very, very important small town outside of Brussels. We didn't send it to Ghent. Everybody knew where it came from. No, you establish it to Brussels because it's the capital of the country. And it's their problem, not our problem. And that's the same all the way around.
The Ghent altar was the first work of art to be returned. On the 21st of August, it began its homeward journey on a plane accompanied by Captain Posey, so that it could be back in Belgium by the 3rd of September 1945, in time for the anniversary of the liberation of Brussels. Today, the altar has been returned to the Cathedral of Ghent, where it's displayed behind bulletproof glass as an additional security measure. It's visited by tens of thousands of tourists every year. Its return in 1945 was an act of great symbolic significance, and at the same time, the start of the greatest recovery of stolen art in the history of mankind. East Germany was now being occupied by the Soviets, who followed a completely different policy. 1,700 paintings were taken to the Soviet Union from Dresden alone. In the long run, however, the Soviet Union was in a difficult situation. On the one hand, the looted paintings were looked upon as being a legitimate reparation for war damages, while on the other hand, it made no sense to withhold them from the socialist brother country, the GDR. In 1955, a compromise was reached, with some of the looted art treasures being returned, accompanied by a great propaganda show.
Dresden, just as in former times, after the city had been laid to waste by the Anglo-American terror bomb attacks, Soviet officers and experts rescued the treasures of the art gallery, including the world-famous Sistine Madonna by Raphael, which were in danger of wasting away in the cellar vaults.
After the end of the war, the works of art which had been removed from the Louvre in August 1939 were also returned. This recovery effort took more than a year. Countless works of art had to be returned to their original location. Then, in May 1946, all preparation work was completed. The world's most famous art museum could reopen. The Jeu de Paume Museum in the heart of Paris, where the Nazis had stored looted works of art during the war, was also reopened in 1946. Once again, it became a public art museum. Rose Valland, the heroine of Jeu de Paume, is unforgotten to this very day. After the war, she was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross of the Federal Republic of Germany and the Légion d'honneur Medal of the French Republic for her service to her country.
Here at the library, we are very proud to have one of the very few complete copies of this directory that she put together, which is 8 volumes and vast. Really, to this day, researchers come to the Frick Art Reference Library to consult what Rose Valland had put together.
Even with the help of the list prepared by Rose Valland, many of the works of art looted by the Nazis have still not been recovered. They remain missing, either destroyed or hanging in museums, private collections and living rooms without their legitimate owners knowing of their whereabouts. The topic of looted art is still relevant today.